My name is Seraphine Vale. I'm 28, and I've spent the last 6 years stabilizing patients in the back of a moving ambulance, with nothing but my hands and a heart monitor between life and death. The text came through at 6:47 p.m. on December 22nd, while I was charting a cardiac call in the Chicago Memorial bullpen. "Mom, don't come this year. No one wants you here. We're doing a family-only Christmas." I read it twice. Then a third time, because some part of me kept waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something kinder. They didn't. My thumb hovered over the screen for a long moment before I locked the phone and slid it into my scrub pocket, the way I'd learned to slide away anything that might slow my hands down on a call. Family only. As if I'd been something else. For the last 5 Christmases I'd shown up anyway, sat at the far end of the table in Cedar Hollow, and absorbed whatever version of failure my family had decided to recycle that year. I should explain something about my family, because numbers tell stories that feelings can't. My older brother Weston is a tax attorney who bought a 4-bedroom colonial in Burlington at 31. My younger sister, Camille, married into the Ashford family, the ones who own half the ski resorts on the eastern seaboard. And me, the one who chose paramedicine over law school, who chose 12-hour shifts, soaked in other people's blood over a corner office. I was the cautionary tale my mother told at dinner parties. "Seraphine's still doing her emergency thing," she'd say, like I was running a lemonade stand instead of restarting hearts. The last time I was home, 2 Christmases ago, my father had raised his glass during the toast and said, "To family, the ones who make us proud, and the ones we love anyway." Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because that's what you do when the joke is built around your own spine. I didn't cry over the text. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect tears in these stories. Some collapse onto the kitchen floor. What I actually did was finish my charting, clock out at 7 p.m., and drive to the Lakeview Hope Shelter on Halsted Street, where I'd been volunteering my Christmas Eves for 3 years running. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because somewhere along the way, serving soup to people who had genuinely lost everything had become more honest than performing gratitude at a table where I wasn't wanted. The shelter smelled like industrial coffee and wet wool coats. Marisol, the director, hugged me at the door like she always did, and for a second, just a second, my throat tightened in a way it hadn't when I read my mother's text. That undid me more than the rejection had. Being wanted somewhere, even in a drafty building with flickering fluorescent lights, hit harder than being unwanted in a house with marble countertops. If you've ever sat with a message like that, the kind that tells you exactly where you rank in your own family, drop a comment. I want to know I'm not the only one who's done the math on love and come up short. By 9 p.m., I was ladling soup into paper bowls for a line that stretched out the door into the snow. An elderly man named Harold told me about his daughter in Phoenix who hadn't called in 4 years. A young mother with 2 kids bundled in mismatched coats thanked me 3 times for a sandwich. I kept my pager clipped to my hip out of habit, even though I was off shift. 6 years of muscle memory doesn't switch off because it's a holiday. That's when the building across the street lit up orange. I heard it before I fully processed it. A deep concussive whump that rattled the shelter's front windows, followed by screaming. The 3-story apartment building on the corner of Halsted and 19th, the one with the faded Sunrise Common sign, had a wall of flame climbing up its eastern face. Black smoke poured from a 3rd-floor window. Someone outside was screaming a name, Danny, Danny, over and over. My training didn't ask permission. It just moved my legs. Seraphine, no. Marisol grabbed my sleeve, but I was already pulling it free, already running across Halsted with my coat, half-buttoned, and my paramedic instincts overriding every ounce of self-preservation I owned. The cold air burned going into my lungs. The heat coming off the building burned coming back out. A woman in her 60s stood on the sidewalk in a thin robe, sobbing that her granddaughter and 2 other children were still on the 2nd floor. That the smoke had come too fast, that the stairwell was already choked black. I did not think about my mother's text message in that moment. I want to be honest about that too. There was no cinematic flashback, no swelling music in my head about being unwanted. There was only the math I'd been trained to do since I was 22 years old. Floor count, smoke density, estimated time before flashover exit routes. My hands went cold and steady the way they always did on a call, the exact opposite of how they felt reading that text 3 hours earlier. I went in through the side door, low where the smoke was thinner near the floor. My eyes burned immediately, vision reduced to shapes and shadows. Somewhere above me, I heard a child coughing. Sharp, wet, panicked. I followed the sound up half a flight of stairs that were already warm under my palms. Quick gut check. If you've ever had to choose between your own safety and showing up for someone who needed you, you already know that hesitation isn't really a choice at all, once your body decides. Tell me in the comments if you've had a moment like that. The second-floor hallway was a wall of gray-black smoke, visibility down to maybe 2 feet. I dropped to my knees, the way every training scenario had drilled into me, and crawled toward the coughing. My hand found a small ankle first. A boy maybe 7, curled against the baseboard where the air was marginally cleaner. I scooped him up, pressed his face into my shoulder, and kept moving, following the wall with my free hand toward the sound of a second weaker cry. A girl, maybe 9, was wedged in a closet doorway, frozen. I didn't have a free arm for her. I made a decision in half a second that I will never fully be able to explain to anyone who hasn't been inside a burning building. I told the boy to hold on to my coat with both fists, no matter what, and I pulled the girl up under my other arm, like she weighed nothing, because in that moment, fear had made her weightless. Or maybe I'd just stopped registering weight at all. We came out the side into freezing air thick with sirens. Firefighters were arriving in a wave of red and white light, and someone was shouting for a third child, a baby, still inside with the elderly grandmother, who'd refused to leave without her. I didn't get the chance to go back in. A firefighter's arm caught me, hauled me back, told me my job was done. I stood on that sidewalk shaking, not from the cold, not entirely, watching 2 more figures emerge from the smoke minutes later, the baby screaming and alive, cradled by a firefighter, and the grandmother behind him, coughing but upright. A news helicopter had been circling a fire 2 blocks over for an unrelated story. It pivoted toward Sunrise Commons within minutes, and somewhere in that footage, unbeknownst to me, was 30 seconds of grainy aerial video, showing a woman in scrub pants and a half-buttoned coat carrying 2 children out of a burning building. I didn't know that yet. I just sat down on the curb, pulled the boy onto my lap, even though I had no medical reason left to hold him, and let him cry into my collar while I checked his pulse out of pure reflex. My phone was still in my coat pocket, screen cracked from when I'd hit the pavement going in. My mother's text was still the last thing on it. Don't come this year. No one wants you here. 3 blocks away, in Cedar Hollow, my family was sitting down to a dinner. I hadn't been invited to, completely unaware that within the hour, a stranger's camera was about to make sure they could never pretend I didn't exist. If you think you know where this goes, stick around, because the family that wrote me out of Christmas is about to find out exactly who they wrote off. The paramedics on scene insisted on checking me out, even though I kept telling them I was fine, that I did this job, that I knew what smoke inhalation felt like from the inside and the outside. A young EMT named Priya wrapped a silver blanket around my shoulders anyway and made me sit in the open doors of an ambulance while she shined a penlight in my eyes. "You're a medic?" she asked, checking my pupils. 6 years, I said. My voice came out scraped thin from the smoke. Then you know you're supposed to wait for backup before going into a structure fire. I know, I said, and left it at that, because explaining that I hadn't been thinking about protocol, that I'd been thinking about a child's coughing and nothing else, felt like more than I had energy for. My hands wouldn't stop trembling, even wrapped in the blanket, even with the worst of the adrenaline starting to drain out of me. Priya noticed and didn't say anything about it, just kept working through her checklist. Pulse, pupils, the careful press of 2 fingers against the inside of my wrist. The same routine I'd run on 100 strangers, without ever once imagining myself on the receiving end of it. It was Priya who noticed the helicopter footage first, pulling it up on her phone while she finished my vitals. "Hey," she said, turning the screen toward me. "That's you." I watched myself on a 4-inch screen, a smudged figure crossing Halsted Street at a dead sprint, disappearing into the side door of a building that looked from above fully engulfed. The footage cut to me coming back out. minutes later with 2 children. Some local news anchor's voice, tinny through the phone speaker, was already calling it an act of extraordinary courage. I didn't feel courageous. I felt like someone whose hands wouldn't stop shaking now that there was nothing left to do with them. Quick check-in: have you ever done something on instinct? Something that felt like just doing your job, only to have other people call it heroic? Let me know below, because I genuinely didn't know how to sit with that word. By the time I got back to my apartment near Lincoln Park, it was past midnight. My coat still smelled like smoke and melted plastic, a smell that clings to the inside of your nose for days, no matter how many times you shower. I peeled it off in the entryway and dropped it straight into a garbage bag, the way I'd learned to do years ago after my first structure fire call, because no amount of detergent ever fully got the smell out of the fibers. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a long time before I let myself look at my phone again. 43 notifications. A handful of texts from coworkers who'd seen the news. A request from a local CBS affiliate asking if I'd be willing to give a statement. And underneath all of that, still sitting there like a stone in my chest, my mother's message from 8 hours earlier. Don't come this year. No one wants you here. I want to talk about arithmetic for a second, because that's the only way I've ever been able to make sense of what happened in my family. Not metaphorical arithmetic. Actual literal accounting of who gave what and who took what. The kind of ledger you keep without meaning to. Until one day you look down and realize you've been balancing someone else's books for 15 years. When I was 19, I drove 4 hours round trip every weekend during my EMT certification to help nurse my grandmother through chemotherapy, sitting beside her hospital bed at 2 in the morning, monitoring her oxygen saturation on a borrowed pulse oximeter, while Weston was too busy with finals and Camille was too sensitive for hospitals. Nobody ever asked how I managed clinical rotations on 4 hours of sleep. Nobody ever thanked me for the gas money I didn't have. When my father's contracting business nearly went under in my last year of paramedic school, I was the one who picked up extra shifts and quietly wired him $3,000. I couldn't afford to lose. No questions asked, no thank you card sent. I remember eating ramen for 2 months afterward and telling myself it didn't matter. That family helps family, that the math would even out eventually. It never did. When Camille got married at the Ashford estate, I worked her wedding like staff, coordinating with caterers, calming her down in the bridal suite when her veil tore, fielding her mother-in-law's passive-aggressive comments about the veil side of the family. And was seated at table 14, near the kitchen doors, while Weston's law school friends got table 2. I remember the specific smell of that bridal suite, hairspray and gardenias, and the specific way Camille gripped my wrist and said, "I can't do this without you." 40 minutes before walking down the aisle without once mentioning me in her toast. None of that had ever bothered me as much as it should have, because I'd been taught, slowly and methodically, that love in my family was something you earned through usefulness. I just hadn't realized, until I was sitting in a dark apartment, smelling like smoke at 1 in the morning, that usefulness had an expiration date, the moment you stopped being convenient. If this is starting to sound familiar. If you've ever been the one who shows up, fixes things, and still gets left off the list. I see you. Tell me what your table 14 moment was. I didn't sleep much that night. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and made tea, sitting at my small kitchen table while my phone buzzed steadily against the wood. Each vibration another headline, another stranger's opinion of a night. I was still trying to process myself. The radiator clanked in the corner the way it always did in December, and somewhere below my window, a snowplow scraped down Halstead, the same street that had been on fire 6 hours earlier. I found the segment that had aired on the 10 o'clock news. A reporter named Diane Castellano standing in front of the smoldering building, narrating my actions in language so dramatic it almost didn't sound like me. "Chicago's Christmas angel," she called me, and I remember laughing. A short, exhausted sound with no humor in it, because angels don't usually get told not to come home for Christmas. What I didn't know that night, what I wouldn't find out until the next morning, was that the segment had been picked up by a national affiliate feed sometime around 11:40 p.m. And in Cedar Hollow, Vermont, my family's Christmas Eve dinner had run long. the way it always did, with my father's second bottle of wine open. And Camille's husband's family there for the first time, everyone performing a kind of holiday perfection that required my absence to function smoothly. I learned later from my Aunt Pauline, who still texted me, even when the rest of the family pretended I didn't exist, exactly how it unfolded. The television in the den had been left on low background noise during dessert, tuned to the local Burlington affiliate that had picked up the Chicago feed as a national human interest story. My mother was mid-sentence, something about how Seraphine had always struggled to find direction, when the anchor's voice cut through the room, identified as 28-year-old Chicago paramedic Seraphine Vale, Pauline said. The room went silent in a way she'd never heard it go silent before. My father set his wineglass down without drinking from it. Camille, according to Pauline, said, "That's not," and then stopped, because the footage answered the question before she could finish asking it. The Ashfords, Camille's in-laws, sat frozen with their dessert forks halfway to their mouths, watching the family they'd just been quietly looking down on produce. Apparently, a national hero. If you've ever pictured the exact moment your family realizes they underestimated you. I want you to imagine it happening over Christmas dinner, on live television, with nowhere for them to look but at each other. I didn't see any of that happen, of course. I was 300 miles away, drinking tea I'd let go cold, watching my phone fill up with messages from people I hadn't spoken to in months. What I did, instead, in the quiet hours before dawn, was something that surprised even me. I opened my laptop and started writing down everything. Not for revenge. Not yet, not consciously. I wrote down the chemotherapy weekends. The $3,000, table 14. I wrote it the way I'd been trained to chart a patient. Factual, sequential, no editorializing. Just the record. I didn't know yet that I'd need it. I just knew that for the first time in my life, I wanted the numbers written down somewhere outside my own head, where I could look at them and finally see the shape of what they added up to. My phone buzzed one more time before I finally let myself sleep. It was my mother. "Sarah, call me. We need to talk." I looked at it for a long moment, thumb hovering the same way it had 12 hours earlier over a very different message. Then I set the phone face down on the nightstand and closed my eyes, because for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't the one who needed something from them. I didn't call my mother back the next morning. Or the morning after that. Instead, I went to work, because Christmas Day doesn't stop people from having heart attacks, and the city doesn't pause its ambulance rotations because a woman went viral overnight. I clocked in at Chicago Memorial at 7 a.m., badge still smelling faintly of smoke, no matter how many times I'd washed my hair, and found half the unit waiting at the bullpen door with their phones out. "You're famous," said Declan, my usual partner, holding up his screen. The clip had over 4 million views by then. Like, actually famous. "I'm tired," I said, and meant it as a complete answer. But the world didn't let me stay tired in peace. By noon, the hospital's PR office had fielded 6 interview requests on my behalf. By 2 p.m., a producer from a national morning show had tracked down my personal cell number, which meant someone in my extended circle had given it out. Probably without thinking twice. By the time my shift ended, I had 11 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, 3 from my mother, 2 from Weston, and 1, startlingly, from Camille, who hadn't called me in over a year. I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage for a long time before I drove home, just breathing. Watching my own hands on the steering wheel, and noting, with the same clinical detachment I'd used to assess a patient, that they'd finally stopped shaking. Declan knocked on my window at one point, asked if I was okay to drive, and I told him I just needed a minute. He didn't push. He just stood there in the cold with me until I gave him a thumbs up, the kind of quiet, undemanding support I realized I'd never once gotten from my own siblings. That night, I did something I want to be honest about, because I think people expect a cleaner version of this story. Some single dramatic moment where I decided to seek revenge. That's not what happened. What happened was smaller and colder than that. I sat down at my kitchen table with the document I'd started writing at 3 a.m. on Christmas, and I kept building it. Dates. Amounts. Receipts I'd kept, half-consciously, for years. The wire transfer confirmation for the $3,000. The printed boarding passes from every holiday I'd flown home on my own dime. while Weston's flights were covered by Dad. A screenshot of the wedding seating chart I'd taken on a whim. Table 14, circled in my own handwriting from 2 years ago like I'd known, even then, that I'd need it someday. If you've ever started keeping a quiet record of how you've been treated, not out of bitterness but just to finally see it clearly, I want you to know that instinct is worth trusting. Comment below if you've ever done the same. Somewhere around the third night of this, 3 nights of working 12-hour shifts and coming home to add another entry to a document I still hadn't named, I had what I can only describe as the arithmetic moment. It didn't arrive with thunder. It arrived while I was reheating leftover soup from the shelter. Standing at my stove in scrub pants, scrolling through years-old text threads on my phone for documentation purposes, when I found a message from my mother dated 4 Christmases ago. Can you cover the caterer deposit for Camille's engagement party? We're a little stretched right now. You're so good with money, not like your brother. I remembered sending that money. $800. I never saw again. Never mentioned again, because bringing it up would have made me difficult, would have made me the daughter who always made things about money. I stood there with the spoon halfway to my mouth and felt something shift in my chest. That wasn't anger, exactly. It was quieter than anger. It was recognition. I kept scrolling, almost compulsively now, and found more. A request for $200 toward Weston's bar exam study materials, just until his signing bonus clears. A request to babysit Camille's future stepchildren for a full weekend, so she and her fiancé could attend a wine tasting in Napa, unpaid, uncompensated, with a follow-up text afterward that simply read, "Thanks, you're a lifesaver," and nothing else. None of these, on their own, had ever felt significant. Stacked together, dated and time-stamped, they read like a ledger of extraction. I'd been too close to see clearly until now. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was infrastructure, the reliable system running quietly in the background that everyone depended on, and no one thought to maintain. You don't invite the plumbing to Christmas dinner. You don't thank the electrical wiring for keeping the lights on. You just use it, year after year, and you only notice it exists when it finally stops working. Or, apparently, when it ends up on the national news. This is the part where I stopped looking for an apology and started looking at the evidence instead. If you've ever realized you were valued for what you provided rather than who you were, you already understand exactly where this is going. I called Aunt Pauline that night, not my mother. Pauline had always existed slightly outside the family's gravitational pull, divorced young, financially independent, with a way of seeing my parents clearly that the rest of us had been trained not to. I asked her, carefully, neutrally, what exactly had been said at that dinner table after the news segment aired. She told me everything. How my father's first words, once the shock wore off, weren't pride. They were calculation. Do you think she'll mention us in interviews? How my mother had immediately started drafting a Facebook post about how proud the family was, a post she hadn't published yet waiting. Pauline suspected to see how the attention developed before committing to a public position. How Camille had gone quiet for the rest of the night, staring at her phone, scrolling through the comments under the viral clip. Comments full of strangers calling me brave, selfless, a credit to my profession. She didn't get a single comment like that on her wedding posts, Pauline said. I think that's what really got to her. Pauline also mentioned, almost as an aside, that my mother had spent part of Boxing Day calling around to old neighbors and church friends, not to share the news with pride exactly, but to gauge reactions, to test out which version of the story. Proud parents, humble parents, parents who'd always known Sarah had it in her, landed best. I asked Pauline if anyone had brought up the fact that I hadn't been invited to Christmas at all. She said no one had. Of course no one had. I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up, not gloating. I want to be clear, there was no satisfaction in it yet, not really. Just clarity. My family hadn't watched that footage and felt grief over 5 years of distance. They'd watched it and started doing math of their own, a different kind than mine, calculating what proximity to my sudden visibility might be worth to them. Quick gut check before we go further. Have you ever caught the people who hurt you recalculating their relationship with you the moment you became useful again? Drop a comment. Because I think this is more common than anyone admits. The interview requests kept coming. I turned most of them down, except one. A small, respected morning program that had covered the shelter's work before. Run by a producer named Imani, who I trusted from prior community segments. I agreed to 15 minutes, on the condition that the focus stayed on the children, the shelter, and fire safety awareness, not on me. I didn't mention my family, not because I was protecting them. I want to be honest about that too, but because I genuinely hadn't decided yet what I wanted to do with what I knew. The document on my laptop had grown to 4 pages. Dates, dollar amounts, screenshots, a timeline that laid out chronologically, painted a picture I'd spent a decade refusing to look at, directly. A family that treated my labor, my money, and my competence as a renewable resource, and my presence as optional. 2 days after the interview aired, the floodgates opened differently than I expected. Not more press, more family. Weston texted first, a message that read like it had been drafted and redrafted. Sarah, I know things have been off between us, but I'm really proud of what you did. We should catch up. No mention of the chemotherapy weekends. No mention of finals being more important than our grandmother's oxygen levels. Then Camille, a single line. Can we talk? I miss you. Then finally, my mother, not a text this time, but a voicemail. Her voice doing the particular performance of warmth she reserved for moments when an audience, real or imagined, might be listening. Sweetheart, we saw everything. We're just so proud of you. We'd love to have you home for New Year's, make up for lost time. I listened to it twice in my dark kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd built a 4-page record of every way they'd quietly extracted value from me and called it love. I thought about Table 14. I thought about $3,000 and an $800 deposit and 100 small invisible debts that had never once been acknowledged, let alone repaid. And for the first time since I was 19 years old, sitting beside my grandmother's hospital bed at 2 a.m, while my siblings slept soundly at home, I didn't feel the old, automatic pull to forgive quickly and keep the peace. I felt, instead, something close to readiness. If you've ever had the people who hurt you suddenly reappear the moment you became valuable, you already know what's coming next. Stick around for the final chapter. Because I didn't go to New Year's empty-handed. I said yes to New Year's. Not because the voicemail moved me, and not because I'd suddenly forgiven 5 years of being told I was the disappointment of the family. I said yes because I'd decided, somewhere between the 4th and 5th page of that document, that I wanted to say what I needed to say in person, where I could watch their faces while I said it. I drove up to Cedar Hollow on December 30th, the same winding mountain road. I'd driven 100 times growing up, past the Lindquists' dairy farm and the little white church where Camille had gotten married. The house looked exactly the way it always did at this time of year. Wreaths on every window. My mother's carefully curated garland wound around the porch, railing, smoke curling steady from the chimney. From the outside, it looked like the kind of house where nothing bad had ever happened. My mother opened the door before I even reached the porch steps, and for a moment, I almost believed the look on her face was real. Sarah, she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like the same perfume she'd worn my entire childhood. We're so proud of you. Thank you, I said, and meant it as politely as I could manage, because I hadn't come to fight in the doorway. The dinner itself was almost unbearable in its normalcy. My father refilled my wine glass twice, asked detailed questions about the fire, the kind of questions I noticed, that were really about the story's reach rather than the children I'd carried out. Weston brought up the news segment 3 separate times, each mention angling slightly toward whether I'd be willing to say a few words at his firm's upcoming charity gala, where apparently having a hero in the family would look good for client relations. Camille sat across from me, quieter than I remembered her, occasionally meeting my eyes and looking away first. It was my mother who finally said it outright, somewhere between the main course and dessert, raising her glass the way my father had 2 Christmases ago. To Seraphine, she said, the daughter who finally found her purpose. I set my fork down. I found my purpose 6 years ago, I said, the day I got my paramedic license. You just weren't paying attention until a camera was. The table went quiet the way Pauline had described it, going quiet on Christmas Eve. My mother's smile flickered but held. Sarah, that's not fair. I have something I want to show you, I said, and reached into my bag for my laptop. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I didn't deliver some triumphant speech. I didn't raise my voice. I opened the document I'd built over 6 nights of insomnia and turned the screen toward the table, and I simply read it out loud, in the same flat, factual tone I used to deliver a patient handoff to an ER doctor. The chemotherapy weekends, dated and totaled in hours. The $3,000, with the wire confirmation number still attached. The $800 caterer deposit. The bar exam materials. The babysitting weekend, in exchange for a 1-line thank you text. Table 14, with a photo of the seating chart I'd kept for reasons I hadn't understood until now. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty, I said when I finished. I'm telling you because I needed to say it once, clearly, in this house, before I decided what happens next. For 5 years I told myself I was imagining the way I was treated here. I wasn't. I have the receipts. Literally. My father's jaw had gone tight in the particular way it did when he was building a counter-argument. We've always loved you, Seraphine. He stopped, recalibrating. We worry about you. We worried this job wasn't stable. You didn't worry, I said. You judged. There's a difference, and I think you know it. Camille was the one who finally broke, her voice small. I didn't know about the wedding seating. I swear I didn't plan that. It was Mom's idea. I believe you, I said. And I did, mostly, because Camille had always been more careless than cruel. Swept along by currents, she rarely questioned. But you also never asked why I was at table 14, instead of with your friends. You just let it happen, the way you let a lot of things happen. If you've ever had to lay your own receipts out on a table, literal or otherwise, just to be believed about your own life, you already know how strange that moment feels. It's not satisfying the way you'd expect. It's just necessary. My mother tried one more time, her voice tightening into something less performative, more desperate. What do you want from us, Sarah? An apology? Fine, we're sorry. Is that what this is about? And this is the part I think about most when I replay that night. I wasn't about it. Not anymore. Somewhere between the fire and the document and the 6 sleepless nights. The part of me that had spent 28 years hungry, for that exact sentence, had quietly stopped being hungry. I didn't need them to apologize. I needed myself to stop waiting for it. No, I said. I don't need an apology from you. I needed to stop needing one. That's different. I closed the laptop. I thanked them for dinner, the way you thank distant acquaintances rather than family, polite and final. My mother reached for my hand, and I let her hold it exactly as long as it took to say goodbye, no longer. Will we see you again? She asked, and there was something almost childlike in how she asked it, like she genuinely didn't understand that the answer depended entirely on what they did next, not on what I felt. Maybe, I said, but not like this. Not as the line item you only remember when I'm useful. I drove back to Chicago that night, instead of staying until morning, the dark mountain roads unwinding behind me. 1 mile marker at a time, my breath fogging the windshield in the cold. I didn't cry on that drive either, though I want to say I expected to. What I felt instead was something closer to weightlessness. The specific, unfamiliar lightness of putting down a ledger I'd been carrying since I was 19 years old. I spent New Year's Eve at the shelter instead, ladling soup again, watching fireworks through the window, with Harold and Marisol, and a dozen people who had far less than my family did, and somehow gave more of themselves without being asked. Around midnight, Marisol handed me a paper cup of sparkling cider and said, "You know, you don't owe anyone an explanation for choosing peace over performance." I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else from that whole strange Christmas. Because that's really what it came down to, in the end. My family had spent years rewarding performance. Weston's law degree, Camille's wedding, the version of success that photographed well. What they'd never learned to value was the quiet, consistent kind of love that shows up without applause. The chemotherapy weekends, the wire transfers, the years of showing up to a table where I was barely tolerated, hoping that eventually, showing up would be enough. It never was enough, and I don't think it ever would have been, not because I wasn't enough, but because I was asking the wrong people to recognize something they'd never been taught to see. Some families measure love in attention and applause. Mine did. The people at that shelter measured it in showing up, in soup ladled at midnight, in a hand on your shoulder when you're shaking, and no one needs you to explain why. I still talk to my family sometimes. Weston and I exchange birthday texts now, and occasionally something almost real passes between us. Camille reached out a few months later, genuinely, without an agenda, and we've slowly started rebuilding something smaller and more honest than what we had before. My parents and I speak maybe 4 times a year, polite and careful, the relationship of 2 people who've agreed to a ceasefire rather than a peace treaty. But the family I actually celebrate holidays with now is the one I found at Lakeview Hope Shelter. Marisol, Harold, a rotating cast of volunteers and regulars who never once made me feel like a line item. We don't share blood. We share something I think matters more: the simple, repeated choice to show up for each other without keeping score. If there's one thing I'd want someone to take from all this, it's that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally don't always do the math the way you think they will, and you're allowed to stop waiting for them to get it right. Worth isn't something other people get to calculate for you. You get to decide who deserves a seat at your table, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't running into a burning building. It's finally walking out of one you've been standing in your whole life. If this story hit close to home, if you've ever had to build your own family from people who chose you, rather than people who were just obligated to, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you believe kindness deserves to be seen, give this video a like and consider subscribing, because there's another story, just like Seraphine's, coming next week.